Good morning and welcome to KIDO Talk Radio, 107.5 FM, 580 AM. Kevin Miller in the morning. Michael Stumo joining us from Coalition for Prosperous America. Michael, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Boy, a pleasure, and we're going to go in depth during your time with us this morning here. So for folks that aren't aware of your organization, we've had you on for years. Coalition for Prosperous America, it really hits home to us right here in a state that we have a lot of ag jobs.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Well, we're a coalition, obviously, of manufacturing, agriculture, and labor. We're from Democrats to Republicans, and we just want to fix trade so that the U.S. benefits from trade and doesn't get harmed by trade, that we're a net exporter, and we don't fund the rise of China and other countries based on the U.S., excessive reliance on the U.S. consumers. So that's what we're about.
So when we take a look at the year that was it a good year for manufacturing and ag here in America?
Yeah, it was kind of divergent. Agriculture has continued a 3-year slump. Manufacturing's done very well with the tariffs. We've recaptured in manufacturing a lot of the U.S. consumer market. The trade skirmish with China is making them have pain. We're not. My members who are intermediate goods manufacturers, including steel-using companies that were concerned about the tariffs, they're doing very well. They're profitable. They're hiring people. Agriculture, however, has been in a state of oversupply globally. That's continued this year, and the trade skirmish with China and the China retaliation, we were insufficiently prepared and have not yet done enough for a national agricultural strategy for corn, soy. Milk has its own problems. Wheat actually isn't doing so bad these days, but we need a stronger strategy for America's farmers and ranchers.
Certainly here in Idaho, we're a big ag state, and you take a look at the farmers. Sometimes, it seems like we forget about just how dependent our country is on ag.
Well, that's right. There's so many. I mean, you can't put an auto plant in every small town. You can't put a Boeing factory. What we have, and as many of your listeners may remember, I'm from Iowa, and corn, soy, hogs, and dairy farm. In the past, and Dad still farms, but you have fields everywhere, and the value add that you get from the commodities and the supply chains, that's all across the country. It's Idaho and wherever, and it's really important that we have we have a strong agricultural income, and we protect it from the subsidies and the strategies of other countries.
Well, let's take a look at the previous regime versus the Trump administration. Has the president been more friendly to ag?
I think it's on ag, it's been about the same. Certainly with ag on the clean water rules, they've repealed some of the rules that treats every little farm pond as a navigable water of the U.S. So that's been good. But on the price side, Sonny Perdue has taken the same sort of free trade track and import facilitation from Argentina and Brazil and beef and the like that the predecessor did. So on manufacturing, Trump is certainly doing a great job with the tariffs. But on ag, we still haven't sort of caught up to an America First agriculture strategy.
Well, how big is ag in our economy today, sir?
Agriculture is not a huge part of the economy. Manufacturing services are the majority part of it, but in rural America, it's a massive part of the economy. So overall, I was actually with my dad in Iowa for Christmas, and he said, we haven't heard a president mention agriculture in the State of the Union address for years. It used to always be in it. It isn't anymore. But we do need to pivot from this free trade will save us all posture in agriculture, because we have a problem of oversupply with Brazil expanding in the Amazon, oversupplying the world. And it's a similar problem to what we see in steel and other products. It's foreign overcapacity causing a glut rather than scarcity. And every other country that's successful has a strategy, and we don't.
It's odd, since we for years have led the world with agriculture, and there's so much pride. And Michael, as a farmer, and your dad's still farming, there are no off days. There are no, holidays where everybody chills out and has a good time. The work is 24/7, 365.
Well, that's right. You may have heard the joke, the difference between What's the difference between dairy farming and being in prison? Well, in prison you don't have to milk cows, right? So, but yeah, we are not the breadbasket of the world. We're not the only breadbasket of the world. Other countries are, producing a lot more than they used to, and it is a different way of thinking with the world of glut. We're getting net imports of pork and beef, and from Mexico and Canada, and it's displacing our domestic market. The free trade groups fought country of origin labeling, so U.S. cattlemen cannot distinguish their beef as quality USA made. And after that country of origin labeling got repealed, the cattle market took a real hit, but meat packer profits went up, doubled. So we really need to devise and consider an America First agriculture strategy that gets fair income to our farmers and ranchers, not just the processors.
Well, what was the reason for not country of origin?
Well, the WTO, World Trade Organization, heard a challenge by Canada and Mexico, which wanted to flood our market with beef and did not want to label it as to country of origin. They brought a case at the World Trade Organization, and the panel ruled for them, creating brand new law that was not in the WTO agreement that was signed and agreed to by Congress in 1995, which said that it was an impermissible burden on imports to have to label as to the country of origin, notwithstanding the fact that every other product coming into the U.S. is labeled as to country of origin. So that was a really bad decision, and Pat Roberts, the chair of the Senate Ag Committee, and a bunch of the multinational meat packers were fighting to get rid of the rule because they want consumers not to know where their meat is made. It's anywhere meat. And so that's been a real problem. And indeed, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association fought country of origin labeling, which is too bad.
Our great friend Michael Stumo joining us from the Coalition for a Prosperous America. It just seems strange. I mean, in Idaho, even though we're one of the fastest growing states, sir, we see the cattle driving home, the farms and everything else, and the sugar beets and the potatoes, obviously. But it's for people listening out on KIDO Talk Radio, it's got to be causing them a little bit of alarm that we're importing beef and pork in America for America?
Oh, sure. Our cattle herd is at a 51 or 2-year low. We continue to be displaced by foreign imports, often subsidized, sometimes because the U.S. dollar value is too high, which also makes U.S. beef and pork higher and the imports less expensive. We do need to get a handle on America's overvalued, non-competitive dollar. But yes, we're a net importer of pork and beef, and that's part of our problem. And like I said, we need to have a strategy. Agriculture has not yet agreed that we really need a strategy to create profitability here and protect our home market from the imports, just as we are in manufacturing under the Trump administration.
Indeed, we do hear a lot about protecting manufacturing and everything else within the administration. Before we switch gears on this, really, what's the future of ag in America today?
The future is how do I predict the future? We really, agriculture is in trouble. The standard family farm is in trouble. We've got, fertilizer costs are going up this year in 2019, despite the low oil prices. Seed costs are remaining the same. I know in the Midwest, in Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, now that they've got the support from the USDA, from Trump's, price support that they declared earlier this year. Now the banks are starting to do some cash flow analysis and lending, but the fundamental switch that we need to make in our thinking in agriculture is this is a world of glut. It's not a world of scarcity. It's not that everyone wants our stuff. There's a lot of competitors, and we have to have a strategy not just for level playing field, but to win not only in our home market but other markets, and that provides broadly shared rural prosperity more than anything else we can do.
Well, and I guess that comes down to the trade war with China. I guess
it does. Yeah, and China is bigger than a trade war. We can't rely on China in agriculture so much anymore, although their soybean importers are hurting. Their buyers of commodity are hurting from the increased prices. But China is a geopolitical rival of ours, and this whole picture of the U.S.-China rivalry is about who is going to be the next superpower for the next many decades. So it's bigger than ag, it's bigger than manufacturing, it's bigger than trade. And so we need to keep that in mind.
Our guest, Michael Stumo, Chief Executive Officer of the Coalition for a Prosperous America, as we talk more about ag and manufacturing here on KIDO Talk Radio, a bipartisan group. So agriculture fascinates me just as someone who lives off the land, sir. I go to the supermarket like 95% of us in the world, but you meet a farmer and you just know they're a good person just based on working. We've got John and Weezer and others listening all the time, whether it's, peppermint, whether it's soybeans, whatever we grow here, and to understand that they're under siege. If we win the trade war with China, what does that mean for farmers, if anything?
Well, the implicit in this phrase, if we win the trade war with China, is there's a lot to unbundle there, because this is really a long-term issue with China. We'll see what the president does, because right now we're in the status of a 90-day delay of a tariff hike on China between going from 10 to 25%. We'll see what happens in late February and March. But, from our perspective at the Coalition for a Prosperous America, this is a long-term effort to prevent China from eroding America's economic, military, and geopolitical advantages. So I don't think we're going to see the end of this movie for a little while. We shouldn't, because the future is at risk. But for agriculture, China will probably have to realize they'll have to import a bunch more of our products. Otherwise, the global wheat, corn, and soybean markets, they're fungible commodities. We'll just have to. It'll ultimately rely on global supply and demand. Brazil might sell a little more to China. We'll sell a little more to where Brazil used to sell, like the EU. We're selling more there. It's going to have to come to a new normal. And again, we need to not be afraid to bring the full force of the U.S. government to make our farmers and ranchers and their supply chain strong again, because that's what most of flyover country lives on, substantially.
More coming up next. We're going to talk a little bit more ag than manufacturing as we preview the Democratic Congress, the president, and all that matters, meat and potato issues here and manufacturing with Michael Stumo. Kevin Miller with you, KIDO Talk Radio. Good morning. You're listening to 107.5 FM, 580 AM. Kevin Miller here once again. Hope you're having a great day. By the way, Happy New Year, everybody. I know it's a little late, but we continue on. Michael Stumo joining us from a Coalition for a Prosperous America. We've talked a lot about, and we did delve a little bit into the farmers, but the ranchers. How are, we've heard about Canadian beef, Mexican beef. What's the deal with the ranchers? And again, Michael, you're educating most of us that whether we go to Winco or Albertsons or Fred Meyer, this is our world. So can you take us behind the scenes of how are the ranchers, Idaho ranchers, American ranchers are doing?
Sure. They're not doing very well right now because we continue having a flood of Mexican and Canadian cattle and beef coming into the U.S. The USDA has made agreements with Brazil and Argentina to facilitate exports in theory to those countries of beef and imports as well. But the fact is that Brazil and Argentina are major net exporters. So they're USDA has facilitated big import agreements, which is harming our ranchers. We have the biggest thing that should be looked at right now is getting Congress or the administration to reinstitute some form of country of origin labeling, because we know that when we had it before the WTO ruled against us in 2015 or 16, after it went away, the prices of U.S. cattle went down when they couldn't label it as USA made, and the meat packer profits doubled. So it was a good bet meat packers to fight the law and finally win. So those are some things we really need to look at.
Well, it seems odd to me that we would never have, made in America. We keep hearing about that with manufacturing, but obviously people in Idaho and all over the country would be buying the beef made in America.
Yes, they would, or certainly a larger portion would. And there's a weird rule because there's a law from 1930 called the Tariff Act of 1930 that requires all products that come in from other countries to be labeled as to the origin country, and for that label of origin country to be maintained all the way to the end user or the consumer. But oddly enough, the USDA, which has listened more to multinational meat packers and the commodity groups that they control, provided some regulations to make a weird exception that allows packaged meat from Mexico or Canada or anywhere else. Once it hits a U.S. facility, it can be unwrapped, wrapped up again, and put product of the USA right on it. Plus, it gets a USDA inspected sticker on it. It's a weird outlier in the world of import, trade and goods, and it's money lost to rural America.
Michael Stumo joining us from Coalition for Prosperous America, KIDO Talk Radio. Kevin Miller in the morning. Traffic and weather together. Let's get you to work safely and on time. Good morning, Dave. Michael, we go back to this, though, this issue of I still can't believe that Congress, is there anybody on the side of ag, on the side of ranchers to try and get this overturned, or is it just a WTO issue?
The National Pork Producers Council is controlled by Chinese-owned Smithfield and funded by them. The National Cattlemen's Beef Association is controlled by Brazilian beef packer JBS, Tyson, Cargill, and the multinationals that would just as soon buy the cheapest cattle anywhere, the cheapest meat anywhere, and launder it as USA product. So the groups that purport to represent cattlemen and pork producers are actually representing the meat packer. And if you are from a rural state, a senator from a rural state, it is very hard to get elected without those larger commodity groups supporting you. And so the Ag Committee of the House and the Senate has been on the side of the multinationals, and they have not yet received the memo or changed in this Trump era that making things here matters rather than maximizing profits of multinationals. So ag is still a problem. And the manufacturing side, we're getting sane now, where we believe that making things here matters and employing people here matters.
Very different from the past few administrations, right?
Well, for the ag committees in the past, yeah, certainly with the Trump and the manufacturing, it's massively different, and he has come under a firestorm of criticism from the globalists on the left and the globalists on the right, who only care about the stock market and corporate profits rather than whether people are employed and can make a living and retire with dignity. But in the ag side, it's an unfortunate continuation from the last 15 or so years.
Yeah, it's just interesting when you, and it's not really interesting, it's disturbing when you think about this. And I didn't know Smithfield was owned by the Chinese. You see them everywhere.
Absolutely. Smithfield was, their first big sin was driving all the independent pork producers out of business, so they're corporatized and chickenized, so everybody is an employee or a contractor at Smithfield, so there's no free market in pork or hogs. I used to be a hog buyer in a prior life myself, and a cattle buyer, and their second sin was then selling to the Chinese. So it was sort of an eyebrow raiser that the Chinese put retaliatory tariffs on pork when the biggest U.S. pork producer and pork packer was Chinese owned. I'm not, sure what kind of discussions happened in Beijing on that, but it did raise an eyebrow.
And by the way, you're a bipartisan guy. Your group is bipartisan, right?
Well, absolutely. We have our chairman is Dan D'Amico. He was from Nucor Steel CEO. He was part of the Trump trade transition team, helped choose Bob Lighthizer as a trade ambassador. We also have AFL-CIO and the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, who definitely were not Trump supporters. So, but trade and making things here in American prosperity and people having a good job and income, that's an American issue. And trade does not cut cleanly down party lines. We have to fix trade as a globalist versus, I suppose, a patriot or an economic nationalist or something, but it's an American issue.
Michael, though you would think traditionally it would be a Democratic issue, because they're always, they've got the Teamsters and the AFL-CIO. They would be sticking up for trade. Will it change a little now that there's a Democratic House?
It will change a little bit, but really, I would expect for 2019 that Congress will only, comment and look for transparency and hold hearings. They do have the big U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement to approve, so that's a significant piece of business on their plate, and there's some issues with that. But the action over the past 40 years, Congress has delegated a tremendous amount of trade authority to the executive branch, and now some of the free traders in Congress, the globalists in Congress, are upset about that because Trump's doing the right thing on trade in most cases. But the actions in the administration side, I used to have 500 meetings a year in the congressional offices, and now I don't have nearly that many because I'm meeting with administration officials because that's where the trade action is. That's where it'll be next year. We'll just hear different noises out of Congress.
What do you make, though, and I don't know if you can comment on this, though, about the media review of the president? Does that get in the way of doing business?
Well, I see MSNBC, I see Fox, I see the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and they're slowly coming along to what, China used to be the great big opportunity on trade. We needed free trade with China. China was going to become a open, free trading, market-oriented economy. It took them 20-some years to figure out that wasn't the case, and a pretty blunt president. But they're saying now that, well, yeah, China's kind of a threat now, but you shouldn't do what you're doing. But they don't have a solution. So they're coming around slowly, but certainly the media, the global punditry, most of the economists have just an incorrect view of trade, that they just want the cheapest price from wherever in the world and never mind where it's produced. But the fact is, where you produce it matters, because if you have income and profits, it's more valuable than marginally cheaper prices. And that's why the big trade surplus countries win and beat us, because they focus on winning the global competition for good jobs and industries rather than cheap prices.
More coming up next. Kevin Miller in the morning, KIDO Talk Radio. Good morning, Maggie. And once again, hope you're having a blessed day. Kevin Miller, thank you for joining us. Don't forget our website, KIDO Talk Radio, and, of course, Two Signals. We want to hear from you, the place to be heard on 107.5 FM, 580 AM. Michael Stumo joining us, Coalition for Prosperous America. You're speaking our language here in Idaho, sir. What about your website if people want to get more information about what they can do to help family farmers and ag here in Idaho?
Sure. Our website is prosperousamerica.org, and we are on the cutting edge of what's going on with trade, with jobs, with agriculture, in relation to trade and the future of the American economy. prosperousamerica.org.
Back to the trade deals. How is our relationship with the Canadians? We heard a lot during the renegotiation of NAFTA about Canadian dairy and them not letting our dairy in. How does that work?
Sure. Well, Canada has a supply management program for dairy. And the thing about agriculture generally is that agriculture tends to overproduce if it can. If prices are high, you produce as much as you can. You can make more money. If prices are low, you produce as much as you can. So at least you can spread fixed costs across more bushels or, 100 weights of milk. So it's very hard for farmers to control supply on their own. And Canada has supply management just like we used to, but they have it in their dairy. They did have a couple rules that discriminated excessively against U.S. imported milk products. That seems to be going away with the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. However, on the scale of things in the U.S. dairy market, it's not going to make much of a difference, a little bit on the edges. We still have an oversupply problem here, and from my perspective, we should be really thinking about, how to manage our market better so we don't just sort of produce ourselves out of business.
We got a lot of dairy here.
Yeah, it's a good business. It's a good business if you can make money at it.
I guess we could say that about everything. So what's the state of manufacturing in America today, sir?
Well, manufacturing's doing, really well. And you know what? I want to go back to your comment of the relationship with Canada, because there's a fundamental implicit issue in what you said, I think, is that a lot of people say we've got to get along with our allies. We have to, keep these relationships. And I'm all for that. But why did the U.S. why does Canada need the U.S. more than we need them? And that's really a false choice, because we're going to trade with Canada, with USMCA, U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement or not. We're going to be trading with Canada. 75% of Canadian exports come here. they can't exist. They can't trade without us. And we do have to watch our national interests. Same with Europe, Japan, and the like. The reason the U.S. became the global superpower is because we built the wealth and ultimately the military strength to become, the global policeman and the world's biggest economy. That's the crux of it. And if we need to, fix things and step on a couple toes, that's fine. We'll get to a new normal. But we don't need to be kowtowing to other countries. We need to take care of ourselves, and then the rest of it takes care of itself as far as global markets and, alliances.
Michael Stumo joining us. Kevin Miller in the morning here, KIDO Talk Radio. Okay, so manufacturing, we hear a lot about it. People say
Right.
that the president, Mr. Stumo, can't bring jobs back. First off, story that broke last year, what do you make of what GM decided to do?
Sure. GM has been on a long course of offshoring their cars among the big three automakers in the U.S. They've led the charge to offshore. This is a mere continuation of it. Their plant closures are all about offshoring to Mexico. It has nothing to do with the tariffs or anything else as far as, steel tariffs. Every other automaker, every other metal user is paying, a little bit more for steel tariffs, but inflation is low, unemployment is low, wages are rising, they're all doing well. So the GM story is all about their offshoring strategy, nothing else.
Well, I know it's got a lot of folks upset, and this outsourcing of
Absolutely.
Outsourcing jobs to Mexico and Canada. Is there any way to really stop that? And then you have the idea, I'm sure you remember this, cash for clunkers, and where GM wanted to get the money but build new shops in China and still call them American made.
Yeah, GM has been a problem. I'd rather have a GM bailout back in 2009 than a Goldman Sachs bailout, because we save a lot more jobs. We don't need to bail out the banksters. But they are not sufficiently grateful. That's for sure. They need to work with us to produce here. But they've got bigger partnerships in China, and they're teaching the Chinese to make cars and ultimately dominate the market. China has more car capacity. I think they have a 42 million capacity for cars. They're only producing 19 million. If we don't get our act together, we will lose our auto industry to China. And that's coming in 5 years. So we really need to figure out how to keep the auto industry, which is among the biggest supply chain employers in the U.S. And when Trump's considering auto tariffs, take a look at what do we keep here for manufacturing in autos? We keep the trucks. They're profitable. They keep the money coming into the auto producers. We have 25% tariffs on trucks. That's protecting our industry and jobs. We only have 2.5% or zero on cars, and the cars are going away, but we keep the trucks. What does that tell you?
Well, it's amazing to me that you have people that can come in, and I understand legacy costs, and Mr. Stumo, you know more about that, forgot more about it than I will here at 107.5 FM on KIDO Talk Radio 580 AM. But, the idea of you can have these manufacturers coming into the South, the American South, the old Confederacy, employ people and churn these things out. And we created, Henry Ford and everything else, the automobile and the supply chain and everything else. And they seem to be beating us at our own game. What's the inside skinny on how the internationalists, the foreigners, can come in on our own turf and produce cars apparently more efficiently than the American companies?
Well, I can't comment on whether they're more efficient. Certainly the southern U.S. isn't unionized. So they are getting lower labor costs in relation to Detroit. But I'd rather have them come here and produce than them producing in Japan or Korea and Germany and then sending them here. When they do come here, some of the profits of these publicly traded companies go overseas, but these are massive supply chains. And when you get a plant in South Carolina or Texas or wherever, there's a huge supply chain. Many of them my members, where American workers are employed and paid good wages, which also push up the wages in their community. So when Japan was kicking our butt back in the 80s, it was all the rage about Japan Inc., and Trump was upset about that at the time, justifiably so. our U.S. dollar was too high. The Japanese were currency manipulators, pushed the yen too low to make their cars cheaper. When Reagan forced the Japanese to revalue and then devalue the U.S. dollar to get the dollar and the yen back closer to competitive rates, Japanese then had to build factories, Honda and Toyota factories in the U.S. because they couldn't make it in Japan and sell it here profitably, and that employed, hundreds of thousands of U.S. workers. So I'm not terribly opposed to them coming here, and that's what China tries to do, is make U.S. companies manufacture there rather than make it here and sell to China.
No, I'm with you, but it just seems that maybe it's out of necessity, sir, that they seem to be more committed to the American market than, the company we were talking about previously, GM.
Yeah, I don't know if they're more committed or, they're driven by profit. That they have different pencils and pens and accountants, I guess, than GM does, but I don't know that BMW in South Carolina loves America any more than GM. They probably don't love America at all, but their workers sure do, and their plant managers sure do. But they're making it work. But we just want to capture those supply chains.
Indeed. Michael Stumo joining us. Michael, one more time, your website. We've got one more segment, but just want to make sure that people can get a hold of you, find out what y'all are doing in Washington. Sure.
ProsperousAmerica.org. And as you said, we're agriculture, manufacturing, and labor, a bipartisan organization working exclusively on trade and U.S. prosperity. All right.
Much more coming up next. You're listening to Kevin Miller on 107.5 FM, 580 AM, KIDO Talk Radio. KIDO Talk Radio, Kevin Miller in the morning. Michael Stumo joining us here, talking about manufacturing, labor, and ag. We've covered labor, we've covered manufacturing. We've covered ag, and we've covered manufacturing. We go to labor, and just it's been a great run for the president, hasn't it, with this record unemployment?
Really has. You get down to 3.9% unemployment, more, less unemployment than, since 1968. And crucial fact, wages are rising because we have lowered the unemployment rate while wages have stagnated. And ultimately, this economy is driven by wages, which push money in the pockets of the everyman and woman that can go buy things that are hopefully U.S. made. So that's been really good. Even as the stock market hasn't done well, largely because the Fed is increasing rates, it's diverging from what's happening in the real economy, where people are being employed. They're hiring, prisoners that get out of prison that couldn't get work before. They're taking a look at them, hiring them. My members, who are intermediate goods manufacturers, their biggest problem now isn't necessarily the Chinese, is trying to find labor so they can get their product made and get out the door. So they're really doing well. It's a good problem to have.
What about the state of the American worker? I've lived in Pittsburgh and in the South, where you've had people coming in and undocumented folks coming in and taking American jobs. Do you guys have a position on that?
We don't do much in immigration, but I will tell you this: whether you're concerned about immigration, let's say it's a problem. Let's assume it's a problem for a moment, where they're taking the jobs of the low-skilled workers. You have a few million, maybe 10 million or something problem. But when you offshore and open up and meld these markets, U.S. to China, that's 1.3 billion people, or Mexico. Free trade puts U.S. workers into competition, low-wage competition, with billions, not a few million, but billions of workers. So even granted, and again, like I say, we don't do the immigration battle, we do the trade battle, but let's grant that we have immigration as an excessive, unwanted competition for U.S. workers. It pales in comparison to the offshoring and the free trade agreements that throw the U.S. worker into competition with the Chinese, the Indians, and the Mexicans with insufficient controls. That doesn't mean don't trade, but it means trade in our interest.
We go back to China here on KIDO Talk Radio, and we take a look at just the overall China influence, militarily, economically, cybersecurity. The U.S. government has a case against them of what they've done to Micron, based here in Boise.
Right.
What do we see of China? Because for years we were fed the propaganda, sir, that China was our friend. It's unlimited markets. It's going to make every American rich.
Right. China is a net producer. They're not a net consumer. When you hear 95 or 98% of the consumers in the world live outside the borders of the U.S., that's really wrong. 95% of producer competitors live outside the U.S. When we brought China into the market, we brought in a massive oversupply of labor that could produce and overproduce without consuming and swamp our market with goods. And so back in 94, what China did, you remember, I'm old enough, I remember in the 70s, you had commercials, feed the poor, starving children in China. In 1994, they devalued their renminbi by 40%. They used tariffs. They used massive subsidies, industrial strategy, which looked like, a Western economist would say that's foolish. They're going to crash. They grew by 16% per year in the 90s, 9% per year in the 2000s, 8% this decade. They used the strategy to grow. And because they're so, and now under President Xi, they really want to be a regional superpower, maybe global, at least erode the U.S. global influence. And so it's a whole different ballgame, and we haven't sufficiently pivoted to where we should be, which is possibly a decoupling from China so they can't fund their military and geopolitical rise off the U.S. consumer market.
Traffic and weather together, KIDO Talk Radio. Let's get you to work safely and on time. Good morning, Dave. Kevin Miller in the morning here. Michael Stumo joining us, Coalition for a Prosperous America. So how, decoupling, how would we do that? What would that look like, decoupling us from China? And would there be a negative impact on the markets? Would it be a negative impact on us here?
Oh, probably not. We've seen it this year that once we've done a little bit of decoupling now with tariffs on a large portion of Chinese imports, not enough to shut them off, but to reduce their volume. And I just saw a report today where 85% of multinational firms are thinking of moving out of China. 70% of Chinese firms are thinking of putting production elsewhere. A lot of it in third countries, some of it here. So part of this game is we want more here. We're seeing it now with manufacturing booming and unemployment very low. We're seeing the influence now that we're getting a benefit from it, and they're not. But overall, China, if you view, as we do, and the president does, views China as a strategic competitor, and considering the rough parallels with the Soviet Union Cold War era, we would have never enabled the rise of the Soviet Union with excessive access to the U.S. consumer market. There was a containment strategy, and we did very well with other countries and with ourselves. If we do a soft version of that with a decoupling with China, let's say put 25% tariffs on everything coming in from China, just to reduce the burden of their imports on our economy, you have a softer version of the containment strategy. That's one aspect. I'm not speaking for the administration, but I have heard some of the administration talk that way.
What about India? Friend or foe?
India is pretty neutral right now. They have their own internal problems. They have 119 languages in that country, and they can't quite get together as a nation. If India, with 1 billion plus people, ever got their act together and was strategic like China, seeking to grow off the backs of foreign consumers excessively rather than promote their own, consumption and balance with their production, if they tried to do it China, we'd be in trouble. Right now, we're not. So if India ever gets its act together, we have a new excessive supply of low-cost labor competing with U.S. workers. And then let's fast forward further. Let's say the African continent got it together and decided to be export-oriented and very strategic and good at it rather than growing internally. That would be another. For the rest of our lifetimes and our children's lifetimes, we're going to be facing a world of oversupply of labor, of goods, and probably agricultural products. So everyone needs to be more strategic.
I guess we just have to do it more efficiently and more effectively here.
We do, but there are things with exchange rates, currency, with tariffs and industrial strategy that make a difference. If we're the only laissez-faire free traders in a world of strategic capitalists, we lose.
Do you think because of the experience that we've had with President Trump, let's say he doesn't run for re-election, maybe he loses re-election, will a Democrat have the same policies, or do you think we could go back to we love China as they continue to rip us off?
Well, I think a lot of the bells that the Trump administration have rung will not be unrung, certainly, but there would probably be some backsliding depending on who. If you have a Sherrod Brown from Ohio, he's likely to be more Trumpian in his trade policy. We actually like Sherrod Brown. I mean, we don't endorse anybody, but we approve of Trump's trade policies, and we like what Sherrod Brown says. If you get someone Beto O'Rourke or Cory Booker, they're they're unreformed free traders, which is a naive approach. As I said, being a naive free trader in a world of strategic capitalists is a losing game. So it depends on which Democrat we're talking about.
Yeah, many different flavors of the Democrats. Michael Stumo, we appreciate it. One more time, your website, and if people would love to support your group, how can they help?
Sure. ProsperousAmerica.org is our website. We're the only national organization representing exclusively domestic producers, bipartisan agriculture, manufacturing, and labor. And ProsperousAmerica.org, that's where you can sign up for more information and keep on top of things.
Want to remind everybody, more coming up. Fox News at the top of the hour. You're listening to Kevin Miller, 107.5 FM, 580 AM.